So today I'm going to run through an overview of the Act as it relates to PIAWE. I will also hand over to my colleague in a few minutes who'll run through some of the nuts and bolts of the provisions. Now, my experience in talking about PIAWE is that it's a topic that can generate quite a lot of discussion, a lot of feedback, a lot of consideration about different scenarios. So what I might do is just ask that we get through the slides first, and if we can hold comments and questions until the end of the slides, just to make sure that we can get through the detail. Gavin mentioned under the case for change that there were key outcomes that were considered when developing the proposed reforms for both disputes and PIAWE, and that was simple, transparent, fair and equitable. And that's very much translated into the PIAWE provisions. So the simplified methodology is designed to support a more simple and more efficient process to determine PIAWE for a range of working arrangements. Quite often through consultation and feedback, stakeholders would say it's very difficult to get the information that was required to determine PIAWE. It was very complex. The provisions were unnecessarily complex in the view of a lot of stakeholders, and then trying to explain that in a simple way to injured workers or the representatives. So very much focused on a more simple and efficient process to determine PIAWE. Now, the PIAWE calculation is easier to understand, and we'll walk through the provisions in a minute, but also to explain it for all stakeholders, and is reflective as well of the workers' actual pre-injury earnings. And the provisions are designed to apply fairly to workers and classes of workers. So before we go through, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the structure of the Act. It has been amended. It is a little bit different. Currently we have the 7 sections in the legislation as well as a schedule. Now the definitions are in Schedule 3 to the Act. The legislation itself outlines the rights and entitlements for workers, and that will provide for the majority of injured workers. But you'll see as we progress through, there's also references to things that the regulation or the guidelines may make provision for, and we'll explain that as we progress through. So as I mentioned, the definitions are now in Schedule 3 to the Act. There is provision to amend the schedule by regulation, and that helps provide some flexibility and keep pace with the changes in the way workers' earnings are determined if required. Move on. So the first definition, the meaning of pre-injury average weekly earnings, this is pretty much word for word what's in the legislation. So PIAWE in relation to an injured worker means the weekly average of the gross pre-injury earnings received by the worker for work in any employment in which the worker was engaged at the time of injury. Now I'll talk a minute about the relevant earning period. But before I move on, minimum PIAWE remains the same. So currently it's prescribed in the regulation. That remains the same, unless of course the regulation is amended. Thank you. So relevant earning period. So essentially the relevant earning period is the 52 weeks immediately before the date of injury. And again, that will account for the majority of impacted injured workers. However, the regulation can provide for the adjustment of the relevant earning period in certain circumstances. And so some of those examples would be to exclude periods of unpaid leave. So it could be someone's had periods of a couple of months of maternity leave, then that could be excluded. It could be to align with an employer's pay cycle, and this is a practical way of making it easier. This can assist in excluding periods of unpaid leave within that relevant earning period. But it can also provide for the adjustment and accommodate changes in earning circumstances. So what we mean by that, it could be a worker has a promotion, there might be a demotion in certain circumstance, there could be a change in hours, a change in role, or a payment of a bonus. So the regulation can provide for those types of scenarios. So agreements relating to PIAWE, this is a new feature of the legislation. This provision allows the worker and the employer to come to an agreement about a PIAWE amount. This is not a decision of an insurer, so it's not a work capacity decision. Now that doesn't mean an insurer may not be required to do a work capacity decision about PIAWE at some point, but that agreement is not a work capacity decision. It's an agreement that's reached by the employer and the worker. It is given effect to by the insurer, so that amount that is agreed can be used by the insurer as the agreed PIAWE amount. Now again, the regulation, this can provide for certain requirements that should be outlined in terms of that agreement. This could include, and I'm saying this could include, it's just food for thought at this point. This is getting developed at the moment. There could be checks and balances in place for workers. There could be an outline of what process requirements there are. So for example, what information is required to be provided to the insurer in terms of that agreement. What an insurer may need to consider when looking at the agreement. When a capacity decision may actually be required to be done by the insurer. Whether an agreement can be varied or subsequently amended, and what PIAWE components may be agreed. So that's a new feature. I'm actually going to, I think I spoke fairly quickly, hand over to my colleague Maria, who's going to run you through the remaining provisions.
I'm going to carry on with PIAWE, but I think where I'll try and talk about existing provisions, new proposed provisions, and do a bit of a comparison to get a bit of context for people. I think the important thing to say about all of this is there is a working group that will be looking at some of these things. And the other important thing to say is, for the most part, we would hope that an agreement would be the solution that would work for a good percentage of workers, so we don't have to go through any more complexity. But there has to be some guidance to assist when a work capacity decision must be made and a work capacity decision has to be reviewed. So that's what the regulations and guidelines will help to do, I hope. So I'll go on to talk about indexation. So there has been a change to indexation for PIAWE. For those familiar with PIAWE, 82A3 meant that when an insurer at the indexation point had to go back to the employer, look at the ordinary earnings but for the injury, and do a comparison to the new indexed PIAWE and make a decision whether or not the PIAWE should be indexed. That was troublesome for an insurer. Sometimes where employers not around anymore, or it's troublesome from an employer to get the information for the insurer, and so that provision's not there anymore. So an insurer won't be required to do the comparison of the ordinary earnings but for the injury, but the rounding is still there. So the rounding provisions that are currently in indexation will still apply. This provision hasn't changed a lot from the current provisions in force. So for a worker, and short-term workers are those workers that have been employed for less than 4 weeks, an insurer still may, that's what the Act currently says, calculate having regard to the prospective earnings. But an insurer also may consider the 4 weeks. And the regulations will provide some kind of indication about how you would determine prospective earnings, and also the considerations you might take for using the 4 weeks. And for example, an example where you might not use 4 weeks is if something happened in that 4 weeks that meant that it's probably not a reasonable reflection of what their earnings would be had they have gone forward and not had an injury. The PIAWE for apprentices, trainees and young people, this one hasn't changed. This one currently sits in Schedule 3, Item 1. Schedule 3 is the schedule that deals with workers with more than one job. This is the first item in that schedule. And what this allows for, and we felt that it's fair that it should continue to allow, for apprentices to have their earnings reviewed every year they go up at their anniversary, if you like, because that's what happens to apprentices when they're at work. They have an increase in earnings on their anniversary. It also allows for trainees and young people, so people under 21 have lower earnings, and it allows you to review PIAWE every year as they reach their birthday for the young workers. And trainees, depending on the training that they're going through related to the job that they're doing. So this provision is the same. For these workers, their PIAWE will have to be reviewed at their either anniversary or birth date. There is one change though. The current provision says that for workers where there is no rate applicable and they reach the age of 21, they would be paid the statutory maximum amount. That's not the case now. So the regulations will allow a method for determining a rate for a worker who is over 21, and there's no rate applicable. Schedule 3, in relation to earnings. Now this is a big change, and this was kind of the nub of the complication of current PIAWE, because the current section 44G have what's called base rate of pay exclusions, which are where an insurer had to go to a Fair Work instrument or some contract and decide if an allowance is included or not. And that took a lot of time. So what the new provisions allow is for allowances to be included. So if a worker earns an allowance, it's part of their PIAWE. Just as when they go back to work and they earn that allowance, it's taken off if it's part of the earnings, current weekly earnings. So it includes base rate of pay, piece rates, commissions, shift penalties and overtime loadings. There are some exclusions though. And they are compulsory superannuation. So just as a worker returns to work and the employer is paying the compulsory superannuation component for their earnings, it's not included. So it's kind of double, they get it doubly if it's included in PIAWE. So compulsory super is not included in PIAWE, nor are non-monetary benefits, which are currently called non-pecuniary benefits in the current Act, if the worker is in receipt of the benefit. A simple example is a car. If a worker gets a car post-injury, they keep the car, they're not entitled to the value of that car in their PIAWE. And that's an interesting provision because it just means that insurer doesn't have to turn their mind to calculating the value of the non-monetary benefit if the worker's still getting it. However, once it's relinquished, that's when they have to consider it and include it in the PIAWE. And the simplest way to define the next exclusion is workers' compensation payments are not earnings. And the regulation will be dealing with how to determine these amounts and exclusions to give some kind of guidance. So the guidelines will provide a little bit more detail around that, and that will be the job of the working party to come up with some of that detail. Monetary value of non-monetary benefits. Now this hasn't changed really from the non-pecuniary benefit provisions that already exist. So where a fringe benefits tax applies to an item that a worker has, it will continue to apply. So you'd use the formula that's currently in the Act and is in the new Act as well to determine the value as a fringe benefit. There are some some non-monetary benefits where there's no fringe benefits tax applicable, and the regulations will give some kind of indication about how to do that calculation to determine amount that's reasonably payable. Now, the meaning of current weekly earnings has changed, and the main reason for the change is there is no longer an E in the weekly payments definition. So if you look at the weekly payment provisions, they don't have the 95% of PIAWE minus D plus E plus D. The algorithm's gone and it's in words and it refers to current weekly earnings. So it's effectively the same, but it also makes a point of updating it to reflect a new definition of PIAWE. So it separates, the current provisions separate ordinary earnings and shift and overtime. There's no difference now. There's no differentiation, if you like, between ordinary earnings and shift and overtime. And it also will allow for what a worker can earn in suitable employment, just as E did before. The definition of current work capacity and no current work capacity has changed, or it's just been updated. And as I said with the weekly payments, there's no formula anymore, but the important thing to remember, there's otherwise no change to the weekly payment calculation. So the entitlement periods remain 95% of PIAWE for the first 13 weeks, and as depending on the circumstances after the second entitlement period, it's either 95% of PIAWE or 80% of PIAWE. It's important to remember there's no change to the definition of a week. So what PIAWE has tried to do with the relevant earning period is by aligning with the pay cycle of an employer, you can clearly define the pay weeks, which is what the headache is post-injury, but there hasn't been a change to that. And overtime and shift allowances continue to be included after 52 weeks. So there's no need to separately calculate them, remove them after 52 weeks because they'll stay for the duration. So the regulations will provide for the adjustment of the relevant earning period to extend or reduce it, and that's in reference to what Bronwyn spoke about earlier, depending on the change of the worker's circumstances, and to accommodate unpaid leave. The regulations will also give some kind of information about agreements and how they might operate. What's to be taken into account when determining PIAWE for short-term workers, so that's less than 4 weeks in prospective. Determining PIAWE for trainees and young people greater than 21 years old. The procedure for work capacity decision, including the adjustment for weekly payments. So that does relate to back pay. Back pay became less of an issue after the 2015 amendments, but it was a big headache before then. And this just gives some support or legislative support when the Commission is looking at work capacity decisions for PIAWE to make it clear what the steps might be. And prescribing the minimum PIAWE. And currently the minimum PIAWE, that hasn't changed. The minimum PIAWE is currently $155 and it's in the regulation. It's not indexed. Nothing's changed there. The current Act allows the regulations to change that for different classes of workers, and it hasn't been done, but that provision is exactly the same, and that could be allowed if the working party turned their mind to it and thought that would be a good thing to do. So this is what the guidelines do. So if you read the provisions there, the regulations will do this. This is what the guidelines will do in the Act. So it will allow provision for earnings for apprentices, trainees and young people, whether a worker is entitled to non-monetary benefit, and I imagine the date that they became disentitled, and the amount that might be reasonably payable, so how that might be determined. So I mentioned the PIAWE working group, and that's already started, so we'll be looking very closely at these things. So in terms of what happens from now, the 1 January date Gavin mentioned is not the case for PIAWE. As you can imagine, or as we're imagining, and we might be wrong, but there are a lot of things to put in place to get these provisions working in a consistent way. System changes, training changes, and lots of people who might be interested in knowing what it's all about. So that date will be determined and confirmed, and the working group, again, is working on when that date might be. So from Ascent, all new injuries won't have shift and overtime. This is important because Ascent is the 26th of October, so it means an insurer no longer has to remove the shift and overtime for workers 52 weeks from Ascent. So that's a bit of a change that's effective now. The new methodology will apply to new injuries from the date of commencement. So although we don't yet know the date of commencement, that's effectively saying that we're still using the current PIAWE provisions until we have that date of commencement, and that's not yet known. And I think that's all from me, I think. Are there any questions about any of that? Sure. Yeah. Can she have it?
An issue came up this week from myself.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be clearer about the relationship between the relevant earnings period and the exclusions from the earnings.
Yes.
So if we're excluding compensation payments,
yes,
how does that affect the relevant earnings period?
So that was.
That might be for the regulation, but in terms of putting it out there, that's something
Yep.
we need to look at.
Oh, you're a bit of a PIAWE nerd. I like you. That was a good question. So that question was, we need to consider the relevant earning period in relation to the exclusions. And it's a good point, because workers who have, you can imagine they have an injury, they're being paid, they're returning to work, some of their earnings are comp isn't earnings, sorry. Some of the money coming in is comp, and some of the money coming in is earnings. And if comp is excluded, then their earnings are diluted. And that change in earnings circumstances is a good example of where we might want to turn our minds to that, because that is really disadvantageous for workers who, for no fault of their own, have had another injury and their PIAWE is completely diluted by the fact that we can't consider workers' compensation payments. And it goes back to the Fair Work Act, which explicitly say too that comp payments aren't earnings. So, we tried to get some consistency there. Oh, sorry, another question?
It's just another point that needs to be considered, if the Act doesn't currently define continuously employed.
Yes.
Continuously employed is not it does not have a definition anyway.
Yes.
So when defining the relevant earnings period, the term continuously employed could mean nothing. It could mean something different to everybody. So just other things that we need to think about.
I also think that's a PIAWE nerd question, but I agree. The Act doesn't define continuously employed, and this has relevance for casual workers who may have spasmodic work over 52 weeks. But I think that there is a place for the working party to consider what is time not worked unpaid leave. I'd probably argue it's not. But because if you consider the time at work for casual workers, they could have long periods of no work, and it's really not their fault that they aren't working if they're, So we just need to think about that, and I wouldn't draw any conclusions yet, because that's the job of the work that we're doing.
From my point of view, a couple of takeaways I take out of what the PIAWE changes are is effectively that the legislative framework provides for the circumstances for the majority of people. That earnings in any employment, doesn't matter how many jobs you have, if you had $60,000 in earnings of one job or three jobs, that's what your earnings are, your gross earnings. Getting rid of that table in Schedule 3 that nobody likes, potentially some of the PIAWE nerds in here do, but I certainly don't like that table in Schedule 3, is a good thing. The other point to note that I see with the PIAWE is that the simplification of not having to calculate the non-pecuniary or the non-monetary benefits until that entitlement is lost. Without having to go in and figure out FBT values, etc., makes the process a lot simpler. And then the flow on change into the calculations and the formula themselves.